Okay, looping structures. Hopefully you're starting to see the value of these. Um, they're incredibly useful, and hopefully your head's getting wrapped around the concept of it and you're able to start using and playing around with them. Because we're going to ratchet up a little bit, we're actually going to do nested for loops. We're going to put loops inside of loops. Um, you ask, can you do that? Absolutely. And you can do some pretty crazy stuff with it. So it's really important to look at this. It's a good way to move around in 2 dimensions. Um, so I have some code that I've already made. We're going to walk through it. You're going to see it in action. I'll put links for this stuff as well so you can download it and play around with it and see what you can do with it. So these are going to be we're going to do things 2 different ways. You've seen if-else statements. We're going to use that to create a pattern, and you've used those so far. What you haven't used is what's called a switch statement, and we're going to see essentially the same thing being built, but just 2 different ways. Um, so let's walk through the code here, and I'll show you how I do things. So up here at the top, the first thing I do is I initialize this variable. I have an int of tile size, and I have it set to 20. I'm going to use this to be able to kind of just iterate and move through. I'm thinking of a tile essentially as a square that I'm going to be building a graphic inside of. So here I have my usual size function. I have a window being set up to 600, 600, anti-aliasing being set up with the smooth function. So here's the loops. Now the link that I put, the little program that I put before, hopefully that's working. You're starting to see how a nested loop works. The outside loop is I'm using for essentially a row, and the X one, the one inside of it, is going to be the columns. Okay, so the first time this runs, this loop starts. I set my variable with inside of it to 0, and this is going to run as long as that value, y, is less than or equal to the height of the window minus that tile size. So it's going to start at 0, and as long as it's 600, so as long as it's less than or equal to 580, it will run. As soon as it becomes the size of the window, it will stop. So I could keep this minus tile size off. It wouldn't hurt, but anything that it draws would be drawn off the screen anyways. So I'm just keeping it within the window frame. And it's going to update itself. So it's going to plus equals that 20 or that tile size each time that this is run. So it starts off with 0, and here is the nested part. So the second loop inside of that is what we're going to make our columns with. And we're using x then as this variable, and it's the exact same thing except I'm doing width instead of height. So it's going to move from 0 all the way to the right until it gets to 580 as well, and then it'll move. So essentially so 580 will be the last time it runs. Once it updates itself and it gets to 600, this will be false, and so it will stop, and the code will return back up to this original for loop, the y one, and this will get updated one time. So y will then be plus or equal that tile size, so y will become 20, and then it'll start running this whole second for loop all over again, starting at 0, moving its way all the way up to 600, where it will cancel itself out. Okay. So once inside of these columns, in a sense, with this second for loop, the code inside of it is going to be this. So I have this new variable that I'm calling line direction, and I'm creating a random number. So this random function is going to give me a number that is starting at 0 and up to, but not including 3. So either a 0, 1, or 2 is what it's going to give me. I have this in a parentheses because the random function returns a float value, so I have to cast it into an integer. And so I have the int here, I have the parentheses, so it'll return either a 0, 1, or 2. Okay? And that'll be set here into the variable of line direction. Now I'm using the line direction essentially my grid, my little boxes. I'm going to draw lines. You can draw anything you want in here. For this pattern that I'm creating, I'm just going to draw lines in different directions. Okay, so the first if statement comes out. It's looking at saying, all right, is line direction, and I have the two equal signs, is it equal to 0? So I'm not setting it. Make sure you don't have one equal sign. So there's the 2. So it's comparing it. Okay, so if it's 0, then it's going to run this code. It's going to set the stroke to a certain weight, to a certain color, and it's going to go in a specific direction. So X and Y, which will be the first time this runs, will be at 0, 0. It'll run from the top then to the X plus tile size, which would be over, and so it'll go from the top left corner to the bottom right corner is what a line will be drawn in this sort of box or grid that I'm creating with the tile sizes. Okay. Now if that random number comes back to be a 1, this won't run, of course. The first if statement won't. The else if will. It'll catch this. All right, there's a 1. This time we're changing the stroke down to pure black. The stroke weight becomes a little thicker, and the line is now going to move from the top right to the bottom left corner. So it just is moving in different directions. And so that's why I used a variable called line direction, just so it makes sense. And then the third one here, if it's a 2, essentially, I'm just going to, so the final else statement is going to catch that. I'm turning off stroke, I'm turning off the fill, and I'm building a rectangle at that X and Y, so the full, basically the box, and it's just going to create a space. So every time this code runs, this line direction with the random function is going to randomly choose a number. So when I compile this code and we see what it looks like, it's essentially this sort of map or maze type of structure. Just lines moving in different directions, and then there's spaces and breaks in there as well. So every time this is run, it's going to look similar because I only have so many rules here. But it essentially is going to be unique, that every time it's going to be different because it's always going to get a unique listing of different directions based upon this random function. So random functions are kind of fun to play with as well. I showed you those a little bit earlier. So it's something to start experimenting with and seeing what you can do with. Okay, so same thing. Let's look at this different structure though of controlling the flow through through this second for loop. Okay, so I'm going to close this down, and so here we're going to look at the switch statements. So everything is absolutely the same except this code down here within here. So the switch statement is here, and I'm using the line direction, which will control how this how things move. So the first here is the case of 0, and so it's essentially like the if statement. So if the case is looking for any time there's a 0, if this is true, then it's going to run this code, okay, until it gets to this break statement. And so the break just breaks out of the switch and tells the program to return back to where it was, which is essentially getting back up to this for loop and a new line direction. So we have a case of 0. That's like our first if statement. We have the case of 1, which is like our else if. And then we have a case of 2. So any of those values that come through. So it could be anything. So here I know what those are, so I set the cases to be, it's either going to be this, this, or this. You could have as many of these as you want. That's what's kind of cool about switch statements. I could have the whole alphabet in here. I could have characters, whatever variable is going to be returned into it. It can look for it. If it sees it, then it's going to run the code within, basically in between the case and then the break statement is what gets run. So if we compile this, it's going to essentially look very similar, but it's just a different way of kind of controlling, making decisions within the program itself. So you can use either or of these, so just different ways of kind of doing the same thing, of generating these patterns. So for loops, nested for loops, very cool stuff, definitely worth putting some time in to understand them. Again, download this code, take a look at it, play with it, see if you can break it, see what you can come up with, and good luck.